Never been a person that believed in the moon landings, that the conspiracy theorists, we were right, and witches who are not trying to be funny. That's the problem when people don't understand that this stuff is real, that you're saying to a witch, yeah, I'll pay for you. I'm going to reach out to you to pay for you to put a curse on Charlie. Theory is that Brigitte Macron was actually born Jean-Michel Trogneux. I want to be very clear. I don't trust anything that crawls out of Argentina with blue eyes. As soon as they give you a boulevard and a holiday, they definitely killed you.
Here on this channel, we're kicking off a brand new series where we're diving deep into some of the wildest conspiracies pushed by Candace Owens. You know Candace. She's not afraid to call out the deep state, question official narratives, and connect dots that the mainstream media ignores. But not all of her theories are created equal. Some are way out there, like her deep dives into Brigitte Macron, which I'll be covering next, or certain assassination claims. But others, they're rooted in declassified documents, Senate hearings, and whistleblower accounts that make them hard to dismiss. That's why I'm starting with this one, the CIA's project, MKUltra. It's the most historically substantiated, interesting, and believable of her conspiracy theories. Candace has brought up MKUltra multiple times on her podcast, especially in her Becoming Brigitte series, where she links it to government mind control experiments, brainwashing through isolation, drugs, and hypnosis. She's suggested that figures like Emmanuel Macron could tie into similar programs, pointing to how the CIA obsessed over conditioning minds, creating Manchurian candidates, and using techniques that sound straight out of a dystopian novel. And honestly, after digging into the evidence myself, I see why she keeps circling back to it. This isn't fringe speculation. It's documented American history, exposed in the 1970s with files that survived despite efforts to destroy them. So let's break it down piece by piece and see how it all fits into the bigger picture of who really pulls the strings behind the scenes. This is a question I've always asked. When people mention Jeffrey Epstein and say he didn't commit suicide, they killed him. Or when someone says, yeah, poor guy was supposed to testify against the Clintons and mysteriously ended up dead, they got him. When people mention the deep state and how they want to control American public opinion, I always used to look them straight in the eye and say, who are they? And finally, I found the answer to that question. And to examine the answer is quite complex, because to do so, we have to look at the evidence and admit to ourselves that there is a group of very powerful people who operate at the highest levels of government in the United States who have no respect for democracy, the Constitution, or the will of the American people. And before you continue watching this video, ask yourself this question. If that's true, if there are a group of cackling psychopaths who run the United States government, would I want to know about it? If the answer is yes, then let me tell you about a CIA project that was discovered in 1975 called MKUltra. In the 1940s, Nazi scientists were said to have developed a truth serum that, in their own words, would eliminate the will of the person being examined, meaning that these prisoners of war, who were literally held in concentration camps, would be injected with hallucinogenic drugs, and their sense of reality would become completely distorted. The Nazis got these prisoners of war to say and think exactly how they wanted them to, even after they'd left their prisons in Germany. What this meant, according to Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the head of the CIA's MKUltra program, was that the Nazis had successfully, and without the victims' knowledge, implanted them with false memories. So naturally, the CIA wanted to undo this whole brainwashing thing. All good so far, right? But then the CIA had a brilliant idea. Sidney Gottlieb wanted to see if the CIA could replicate the effects of the Nazi doctors. The stated goals of MKUltra were to weaken the mind of individuals and force confessions through brainwashing and psychological torture.
Yes, they deserve to die, and I hope they burn in hell!
And false memory implantation, and coinciding with CIA Project Artichoke to determine whether a person could be involuntarily made to perform an assassination without them remembering it, or creating what is known as a Manchurian candidate. And I do have to add a quick disclaimer and give the CIA credit where it is due. They didn't just use hallucinogenic drugs to warp people's minds. They also employed more family-friendly tactics like electroshock, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, torture, and types of abuse that I'm not allowed to talk about here on YouTube. The entire scope of MKUltra will probably never come to light, and that's because in 1973, Richard Helms, the director of the CIA, ordered that all files with information pertaining to MKUltra were to be destroyed. But because of the courageous journalist who found existing documents in offshore warehouses that the CIA forgot about, as well as intelligence community whistleblowers, we still have a pretty good idea of how the CIA conducted Project MKUltra. Of course, Sidney Gottlieb, he seems so much like a mobster instead of the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. He couldn't just start up a CIA volunteer program. Like, how would he advertise it? Greetings, American citizens. Any of you pathetic little peons interested in being psychologically tortured, forcibly injected with LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs, hypnotized and implanted with false memories until you lose your little minds? But here's the beauty of it. He didn't have to make an advertisement because, like any good school teacher will tell you, if you can't find a volunteer, you just volunteer somebody. That's right. The CIA developed fake front organizations to fund, infiltrate, and direct medical research into colleges, research institutions, and in the field where they would experiment on patients without their knowledge, using every method in their MKUltra playbook to see if they could replicate the effects of the Nazi scientists. One example of the research the CIA conducted for Project MKUltra was called Operation Midnight Climax. During this project, the CIA set up safe houses in big cities that they would turn into brothels. They would lure the patrons of these brothels into the not-so-safe safe houses, where in place of, or sometimes in addition to, getting their usual services, they would also be drugged with LSD without their consent, so that the CIA could see if the prostitutes could extract confessions from them or manipulate their behavior. And during this whole time, CIA agents, including MKUltra's head, Sidney Gottlieb, would observe the whole thing through a one-way glass mirror. And can I just say for 1 second, the name of Operation Midnight Climax is freaking brilliant. Like, so fitting. But if you guessed what it actually was, they'd just be like, no, that's code for something else. But not everyone in the CIA approved of MKUltra. In 1953, a CIA operative named Frank Olson, who was also a biological warfare specialist, became disillusioned with the ethics of the experiments conducted by the CIA and the harm they did. During this time, around February of that year, prisoners of war in what later became North Korea declared that the United States government used biological weapons against Korea. Hostile investigations were opened up on these prisoners when they returned from the war, and Frank Olson, one of the few people who knew about MKUltra, attended the interrogations of these men. And Olson, a specialist in biological warfare, became convinced that the US had used biological weapons to spread diseases such as cholera and plague, although these claims were refuted by Western scientists. Olson's son Eric said this after witnessing how his father had changed after becoming involved in MKUltra. He'd come to work in the morning and see piles of dead monkeys that had been experimented on. That messes with you. He wasn't the right guy for that. Eric also said that his father witnessed people literally interrogated to death in experimental methods combining drugs, hypnosis, and torture to attempt to master brainwashing techniques and memory erasing. We will never know in full detail what Frank Olson's issues were with the experiment. On November 19th, official records indicate that Frank was drugged by MKUltra director Sidney Gottlieb with what at the time was dubbed to be a truth serum, a cocktail later discovered to contain LSD and possibly other substances. The next morning, Agent Olson returned home and had a meal with his family in which he seemed distant and refused to eat, speak about his trip, or interact with his children. At one point, he uttered, "I've made a terrible mistake." The CIA assigned Olson with a babysitter, Robert Lashbrook, who was the chief aide to Sidney Gottlieb, the man who poisoned Olson. The official story and the narrative questioned by the hotel manager where Lashbrook and Olson were staying on the dreadful night of November 28th is as follows. Olson got up at 2 a.m, ran through a pitch-black room in his underwear, avoiding 2 beds, dove through a closed windows with shades and curtains drawn, and fell 10 stories to his death. A 1994 forensic analysis of the incident suggests that Frank may not have voluntarily jumped, and for some odd reason his family doesn't believe the CIA's official narrative. But in 1975, the CIA and President of the United States issued an apology to Agent Olson's family for his death and gave them a $750,000 settlement. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room as it pertains to the CIA and Project MKUltra. That elephant's name was Tusco, who resided at the Lincoln Park Zoo. In 1962, a CIA-funded psychiatrist named Jolly West, who was heavily involved with Project MKUltra, injected Tusco with LSD in an attempt to observe the drug's effects on animal behavior. Sadly, after being injected with a dose strong enough to kill 3,000 humans, Tusco collapsed to the ground and died about an hour and 45 minutes later. West, who became the head of the psychiatry department at UCLA, used his position to further the CIA's research into mind control. He successfully induced violence in rats by giving them LSD, causing them to murder other rats. And this is where the CIA's official record stops. Although the CIA successfully induced animals into committing acts of violence and killed humans in pursuit of perfecting their mind control program, MKUltra director Sidney Gottlieb testified before the Church Committee, a group of senators that investigated abuses by United States intelligence agencies, stating that the CIA had never achieved the goals it set out to achieve at the outset of the MKUltra program. And since the CIA destroyed nearly all of the physical evidence 2 years prior, there wasn't really any way to verify whether or not the guy who poisoned his fellow CIA agent was telling the truth. But why would any of us question a guy like that? And this is where the story would have stopped if it hadn't been for an incredibly talented journalist named Tom O'Neill. Jolly West, the guy who killed the elephant, became one of MKUltra's lead researchers. And a few years before the elephant incident, in the year of 1954, he was stationed at Lackland Air Force Base. Because of West's career at UCLA, Tom O'Neill went digging in the college's archives to see if he could dig up anything related to Jolly West, and more specifically, anything during West's time at Lackland Air Force Base. And boy, oh boy, did O'Neill strike cold. During his lifetime, West denied any involvement with MKUltra. However, in UCLA's archives were handwritten letters between Jolly West and Sidney Gottlieb, the head of the MKUltra program himself. In these back-and-forth letters, we get very specific ideas of what exactly West was doing during his time at Lackland Air Force Base. In one of the letters, he discusses how setting up a medical clinic, specifically with mentally ill patients, would be a great way to find participants in MKUltra's program. In another letter, he requests that one of his superiors, Dr. Russell F. Merritt, one of the heads of the psychiatry department at Lackland Air Force Base, be removed. West stated that Merritt didn't approve of the methods he used and viewed them, specifically West's use of hypnosis, as tampering with the soul. On July 4th of that year, 1954, a 29-year-old airman, Jimmy Shaver of Lackland Air Force Base, was arrested for murder. 3-year-old Sherry Jo Horton was in the parking lot of a bar playing with her 4-year-old brother Bobby when she went missing. Upon discovering that their child was gone, Sherry's parents formed a search party and went looking for her. An hour later, rescuers found a car parked next to the side of the road by a gravel pit, with an article of Sherry's clothing hanging from the car window. 29-year-old Jimmy Shaver was shirtless. There was blood all over his body, and witnesses described him as being in a trance-like state. Officers determined that he wasn't drunk, but was probably high on something. Without any struggle, the search party led him to the side of the road, and he was in a daze, muttering, "What's going on here?" Tragically, Sherry had been killed. The next morning, Jimmy's wife arrived at the police station, but he didn't recognize her. Police were baffled. Jimmy was still in a trance-like state, but he wasn't drunk, had no record or history of violence, and no documented history of mental illness. But it wouldn't be the Roswell Police Department's problem for long. Curiously, military police came to the local police station, taking Jimmy out of police custody and bringing him across state lines to Dr. Jolly West. After an interrogation by Dr. West, which involved hypnosis, injections of sodium pentothal, and LSD truth serum, and the use of leading questions, Dr. West extracted a confession out of Jimmy. One witness stated that Jimmy's mouth hung open, his face turned white with shock, and he began to weep when he remembered what he'd done. Oddly enough, Dr. West acted for the defense, stating that Jimmy suffered a bout of temporary insanity when he murdered Sherry Horton, but that he was in his right mind when he'd made the confession, and that he was in his right mind at the court hearing. But news reporters present in the courtroom disagreed. Jimmy barely spoke. He was said to be dazed and in a fugue state. Some believed it was an act, and others believed there were more subtle signs showing that Jimmy wasn't in his right mind. For example, Jimmy was known to be a chain smoker, but even though he was given the opportunity to smoke during the trial, he didn't take it. Despite Dr. West, the man who interrogated Jimmy, acting for the defense, Jimmy was found guilty by a jury of his peers. Jimmy Shaver was executed via electric chair on his 33rd birthday. No one knew at the time of Dr. West's involvement in MKUltra, his testing on animals to make them perform acts of aggression, or his desire to extend his efforts on human subjects. And oddly enough, Jimmy Shaver did receive psychiatric treatment at Lackland Air Force Base during the time Dr. West was furthering the CIA's research into MKUltra. Shaver had headaches so painful that he was known to dunk his head into buckets of ice water. Unfortunately, after the murder of Sherry Horton, all records of Jimmy Shaver's medical treatment, records of the people who treated him at Lackland Air Force Base, were conveniently lost. And it would be over 45 years before anyone discovered Dr. West's letter to the black sorcerer of MKUltra, Sidney Gottlieb himself, stating that he had succeeded in accomplishing the original goals of the CIA, which again, to remind you, are planting false memories without the victim's knowledge, getting someone to commit an act of violence or assassination without the victim having memory of the event. And this was especially a goal for West, to induce psychosis and mental illness with hypnosis and the use of mind-altering substances. So, according to the letters discovered at the archives at the library of the UCLA, Gottlieb lied before the Church Committee. The CIA had, according to Dr. West, developed a technique capable of bending the will of an ordinary person and coercing them to conduct acts of violence, implanting false memories into someone's mind without their knowledge, and making someone go insane. What does this discovery mean for the United States public? Did the CIA ever introduce MKUltra into the field, as Dr. West expressed interest in doing? And did Dr. West meet with the killer behind one of the most prolific public assassinations in American history shortly before he, much like Jimmy Shaver, lost his mind and appeared to act in a trance-like state? We will cover this and more in the next episode of Behind the Chaos. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's keep peeling back the layers together. See you in the next one.